Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me tonight, ready to slow down, to breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift across an ancient landscape where mysteries are written in stone and sand. This is your moment to step away from the rush of the modern world, to leave behind screens and deadlines and all the noise that fills your days, and step gently onto the sun-scorched plains of southern Peru, where 2,000 years ago, people looked at an empty desert and decided to create something that would outlast empires, outlast memory itself, outlast almost everything we think of as permanent. Here, in this space between past and present, we walk together across one of the world's most extraordinary canvases. We trace lines that stretch for miles across rust-coloured earth, forming shapes so vast that only the sky can see them whole. We stand where ancient feet once walked in careful procession, following paths laid out with such precision that modern surveyors still marvel at the mathematics hidden in the dust. We imagine the hands that cleared millions of stones, one by one, revealing the lighter soil beneath, creating images of hummingbirds and spiders, monkeys and whales, geometric patterns that seem to point toward distant mountains where water once flowed and gods were believed to dwell. Each episode here isn't just about ancient mysteries or unsolved puzzles catalogued in documentaries. It's about the lives lived, the beliefs held, the ceremonies performed under desert stars by people who looked at this barren landscape and saw something sacred. It's about the priest walking the spiral at dawn, the community gathering to clear another line, the child learning the old stories about why these images matter, why they must be preserved, why they must endure. It's about the faith that drove them to transform an entire valley into a monument, the hope that sustained them through drought and hardship, the vision that still whispers across the centuries, waiting patiently for us to understand. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and subscribe help keep this channel alive. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen, drift, and dream. 2,000 years ago, the coastal desert of southern Peru stretched beneath the same relentless sun that bakes it today. This is one of the driest places on Earth, a landscape so barren that rain might fall once a decade, if at all. The Nazca region sits between the Pacific Ocean and the Andes Mountains, caught in a rain shadow that transforms the land into endless plains of rust-coloured earth, scattered stones, and profound silence. To walk here is to understand what absence means. No trees break the horizon, no grass softens the ground. The wind moves across empty space, carrying dust that sparkles with tiny fragments of quartz, and when the sun sets, the temperature drops so quickly you can feel the desert exhale. Yet people lived here, they thrived here. The Nazca culture, flourishing from around 200 BCE to 600 CE, built their civilization in one of the most inhospitable environments imaginable. They did this because of water, or more precisely, because of the underground water that flows beneath this desert in subterranean rivers fed by Andean snowmelt. Where these hidden channels came close to the surface, the Nazca people dug wells and created aqueducts, ingenious systems called puquios that are still used today, still bringing water to crops in a land that should support nothing but stones. The towns they built were small by the standards of other great civilizations. There were no towering pyramids here, no massive city walls, nothing that announced power and permanence in the way that Memphis or Babylon or Rome proclaimed their greatness. Instead, the Nazca people built with adobe, sun-dried mud bricks that melted back into the earth when abandoned. Their temples were modest, their homes were simple. What remains today are fragments, low walls barely visible against the desert floor, pottery shards scattered across the sand, and the sense that something important happened here, something that left traces too faint for casual observation. But they were not a simple people. The pottery they created ranks among the finest in the ancient Americas, vessels painted with supernatural beings and geometric patterns and colours that still glow with intensity after 2 millennia buried in dry sand. They wove textiles so fine, so complex in their designs, that modern weavers study them with reverence and sometimes despair at matching the skill. They understood astronomy, tracking the movements of stars and planets with precision. They understood engineering, creating those water systems that defied the desert's cruelty. They understood their landscape intimately, knew every fold in the distant mountains, every seasonal change in the wind, every sign that water might be found or that drought was coming. And they understood something else. something that drove them to undertake a project so vast, so ambitious, that it transforms our understanding of what ancient peoples could conceive and accomplish. They looked at the empty pampa, the flat desert plains that stretched between their valley settlements, and saw possibility. They saw a canvas. They saw a place to create something that would speak to forces beyond human understanding, something that would endure when their towns crumbled, when their names were forgotten, when even their language disappeared into history's silence. The work began slowly, perhaps with a single line cleared across the desert floor. The method was simple but required enormous labour. Workers would remove the dark, oxidized stones that covered the surface, revealing the lighter soil beneath. These stones, each one darkened by centuries of desert varnish, a chemical process that coats exposed rock with manganese and iron oxides, were carefully placed along the edges of the cleared path, creating borders that defined the design. The contrast was subtle but visible, especially in the long light of morning or evening when shadows emphasized every texture, every variation in the surface. They started with straight lines, some extending for miles across the pampa, pointing toward distant peaks or following sight lines that connected ceremonial centers. Then came the trapezoids, massive geometric shapes that widened as they stretched across the landscape. Then came the spirals, the zigzags, the rectangular clearings that might have served as gathering places for ceremonies that no living person remembers. And finally, perhaps centuries into this great project, came the figures, the famous geoglyphs that would one day capture the world's imagination and spark debates that continue still. A hummingbird, its wings spread wide, its long beak pointing toward the horizon, created from a single continuous line that never crosses itself, a marvel of planning and execution. A spider, anatomically accurate enough that modern zoologists can identify its species. A monkey with a curled tail. A whale swimming through stone and dust. A condor, its wings stretching across acres of desert. More than 70 animal figures, each one created with such care, such attention to proportion and detail, that they could only have been designed by artists who understood their subjects deeply, who had studied the natural world with the patience of scientists and the vision of dreamers. But here is the profound mystery that haunted everyone who later discovered these works. The figures are enormous. The hummingbird spans more than 300 feet. The spider is nearly 150 feet long. The monkey covers 200 feet of desert floor. And from ground level, standing among the stones and dust, you cannot see them. You cannot perceive the shape. You see only random clearings, disconnected lines, patterns without meaning. The figures reveal themselves only from above, from heights that the Nazca people could never reach, from perspectives they could never occupy. Why would a culture without flying machines create art that only the sky could appreciate? Who were they speaking to? What message were they trying to send? These questions would obsess researchers for generations, would spawn theories ranging from sober archaeology to wild speculation, would make this desert one of the most studied and least understood places on Earth. But in those early centuries when the work was still new, when the creators themselves walked these lines and understood their purpose, there was no mystery. There was only faith, ritual, and the absolute certainty that what they were doing mattered, that these marks in the desert served a function so important that generation after generation continued the work, expanding the designs, maintaining the clearings, walking the paths in ceremonies whose meaning has vanished into time's abyss, leaving only the lines themselves as testimony to belief we can barely imagine. The lines waited in silence for centuries after the Nazca culture faded. Spanish conquistadors marched through the region in the 1500s, seeking gold and converts, but they travelled through valleys, following rivers and established paths, never climbing to heights where the full scope of the lines might reveal itself. Local people knew about the clearings, called them siques, sacred pathways, but the true scale remained hidden, the patterns invisible to anyone without wings. The first written description came from a Spanish magistrate named Luis Monzon in 1586. He mentioned ancient roads on the plains, but his account was brief, matter-of-fact, treating them as unremarkable features of a landscape he was tasked with cataloguing for colonial administration. No one investigated further. The lines remained a footnote in historical records, barely noticed, certainly not celebrated, just one more curiosity in a land full of ruins and mysteries that the Spanish Empire had neither time nor interest to properly explore. For 3 more centuries they lay there, slowly accumulating dust, gradually weathering under that relentless desert sun. Occasionally travellers would cross the pampa and notice the clearings, might even remark on the straightness of some lines, but without aerial perspective, without any way to see the complete designs, they remained incomprehensible, easily dismissed as ancient pathways or irrigation channels that had long since ceased to function. Everything changed with the airplane. In 1927, commercial airlines began flying routes between Lima and Arequipa, passing directly over the Nazca region. Pilots noticed strange markings on the desert floor, lines and clearings that seemed too regular to be natural, too extensive to be accidental. They mentioned it in reports, described it to passengers, but the altitude was too high, the speed too fast for detailed observation. The lines were intriguing but remained poorly documented, another oddity seen from the sky and quickly forgotten. Then came Paul Kosok, an American historian from Long Island University. He arrived in Peru in 1941 to study ancient irrigation systems. His interest was practical, academic, focused on understanding how pre-Columbian cultures had managed water in an arid environment. He'd read reports about ancient aqueducts near Nazca and decided to investigate. He hired a small plane to survey the region from above, hoping to trace the paths of ancient canals, to map out the engineering that had sustained civilization in the desert. What he saw changed everything. On June 22, 1941, flying low over the pampa in late afternoon light, Kosok looked down and saw not random clearings but deliberate designs. Lines extended for miles, perfectly straight despite the terrain. Geometric shapes, trapezoids and spirals covered acres of desert floor. And then he saw something that made him order the pilot to circle back, to fly lower, to give him time to understand what his eyes were reporting. A bird, massive, unmistakable, its wings spread across the desert in sweeping curves that could only be intentional, could only be art. He took photographs, hands shaking with excitement, already understanding that this was significant, that this was a discovery that would reshape understanding of ancient Peru. But he had no idea yet just how significant, just how vast the system of lines and figures actually was. He returned the next day with better cameras, with more film, with a surveyor's determination to document everything he could see. He mapped the lines, traced their directions, noted their relationships to mountains and valleys and distant peaks. And then, on the winter solstice, June 21st, he made another observation that would fuel theories for decades to come. He noticed that one of the long straight lines pointed directly toward the setting sun on that shortest day of the year, the moment when the sun reaches its northernmost point before beginning its return journey south. Astronomy. The lines had something to do with astronomy. Kosok was certain of it, convinced that the Nazca people had created a vast astronomical calendar, a way to track the sun's movement, to mark the changing seasons, to know when to plant and when to harvest in a land where such knowledge meant the difference between survival and starvation. He published his findings in popular magazines, gave lectures, showed his photographs to audiences who gasped at the scale and precision of what ancient hands had created. But Kosok was a busy academic with other projects demanding his attention. He couldn't devote his life to Nazca. He needed someone else to continue the work, someone with the passion and dedication to undertake a proper study of these mysterious lines. He found that person in Maria Rieger, a German mathematician and translator who had come to Peru as a young woman and fallen in love with the country, with its history, with its endless capacity to surprise and inspire. Rieger saw Kosok's photographs in 1946 and was immediately captivated. She travelled to Nazca, climbed a small hill overlooking the pampa, and spent hours studying the lines through binoculars, sketching what she saw, trying to understand the patterns. Then she did something that would define the rest of her life. She moved to Nazca permanently, buying a simple house near the lines, dedicating herself completely to their study, their protection, their preservation. For the next 50 years, Maria Rieger walked the pampa every day. She measured lines with tape measure and compass, crawled across the desert floor examining how stones had been cleared, how borders had been defined, how the ancient artists had maintained such perfect proportions in figures that stretched for hundreds of feet. She climbed, stepladders in the middle of the desert trying to see complete shapes that were meant to be viewed from far above. She created detailed maps, mathematical analyses, astronomical calculations, all by hand, all with tools that would seem primitive by modern standards, but which allowed her to develop an intimate understanding of the lines that no one else possessed. She became their guardian, chasing away people who tried to drive vehicles across the fragile clearings, lobbying the Peruvian government for protection, using her own money to fund preservation efforts when official support proved inadequate. She slept in a tent on the pampa during full moons, believing that the lines looked most beautiful in moonlight, most magical, most worthy of the devotion she'd given them. The world started paying attention. Journalists came to interview the eccentric German woman living alone in the desert, obsessed with ancient lines. Tourists began arriving, wanting to see the mysterious geoglyphs for themselves. Airlines added sightseeing flights over Nazca to their offerings, allowing visitors to see from the sky what the ancient people had created on the ground. The Peruvian government, recognizing both the cultural significance and the tourism potential, designated the area as protected, made it illegal to disturb the lines, eventually helped fund proper preservation and study. By the 1970s and 80s, the Nazca Lines had become world famous, one of Peru's most celebrated archaeological treasures, right alongside Machu Picchu and the great Inca monuments. UNESCO declared them a World Heritage Site in 1994, officially recognizing their importance to human history, their value to all peoples, their need for protection for future generations. But recognition brought new dangers. Increased tourism meant increased impact on the fragile desert surface. Development pressures threatened to encroach on the protected area. And the attention attracted not just scientists and tourists, but also pseudoscientists and conspiracy theorists who saw in the lines evidence of everything from alien visitors to lost civilizations with impossible technologies, theories that distracted from serious study and often showed profound disrespect for the actual people who had created these magnificent works. The discovery was complete, but understanding had barely begun. The lines were famous now, protected now, celebrated now, but what they meant, why they had been created, what purpose they had served remained as mysterious as ever. Perhaps more mysterious now that researchers understood just how complex, how extensive, how precisely executed the entire system actually was. When Paul Kosok first published his photographs and theories about the Nazca Lines, the response from the academic community was mixed, careful, weighted with the skepticism that good scientists must maintain when confronted with extraordinary claims. Here were images that seemed to show vast artistic works created by a pre-Columbian culture, works that spanned miles of desert, works that could only be fully appreciated from the air, from heights that shouldn't have been accessible to ancient peoples. Some scholars embraced the discovery immediately. Here was clear evidence that the cultures of ancient Peru were far more sophisticated than previously believed, that they possessed mathematical knowledge, planning capabilities, and organizational structures capable of executing projects on a scale that rivaled the great monuments of other civilizations. The lines proved that the Americas had their own traditions of monumental art, their own ways of expressing cultural and religious ideas through landscape modification, their own genius that didn't need to be compared to or validated by European or Asian accomplishments. Others were more cautious. The astronomical calendar theory that Kosok proposed, while intriguing, needed rigorous testing. Yes, some lines pointed towards solstice sunrises or sunsets, but with hundreds of lines crisscrossing the pampa, some alignments would occur by pure chance. Science demanded proof, not just correlation. The fact that one line pointed to the sunset on the winter solstice didn't mean that was its purpose, didn't mean the Nazca people had intended it as an astronomical marker. It might be coincidence, or the alignment might be secondary to some other function that researchers hadn't yet considered. And then there were the skeptics who questioned everything. How could a culture without written language, without metal tools beyond basic copper implements, without the wheel or beasts of burden, create such precise geometric forms across such vast distances? The surveying alone would require sophisticated mathematics, the ability to maintain straight lines over miles of uneven terrain, the capacity to scale up small designs to massive proportions without losing accuracy. Even with modern tools, such a project would be challenging. How had people working with ropes and stakes and their own eyes managed to achieve such precision? Some suggested that the figures couldn't be as ancient as claimed, that they must be more recent creations, perhaps from the colonial period or even later. This theory collapsed quickly when pottery shards found within the lines were dated to the Nazca period, and when studies of the desert varnish on the cleared stones confirmed ages consistent with ancient construction. The lines were genuine, and they were old, impossibly old for something so well preserved, so clearly visible. Maria Reicher faced particular scrutiny. A woman, a foreigner, a mathematician rather than a trained archaeologist, making bold claims about astronomical alignments and mathematical sophistication in ancient Peru. Some colleagues respected her dedication but questioned her conclusions, worried that her passion might be leading her to see patterns that weren't really there, to find meaning in arrangements that might be random or might serve purposes that had nothing to do with astronomy. She responded with data. Year after year she measured, calculated, documented, created mathematical proofs that the lines weren't random, that they showed clear evidence of planning and purpose. She demonstrated that the ancient artists had used grids and scale models to maintain proportions, that they had sophisticated methods for creating curves and maintaining symmetry, that they understood principles of geometry that wouldn't be formally described by European mathematicians for centuries after the Nazca culture disappeared. But her astronomical theories proved harder to defend. Other researchers, checking her calculations, found that many proposed alignments didn't hold up under scrutiny. Some lines pointed to celestial events, but many didn't. Some figures seemed oriented to astronomical phenomena, but others had no clear relationship to sun, moon, or stars. The calendar theory, while appealing, couldn't explain the full complexity of what existed on the Pampa. Public response was less nuanced. Newspapers and magazines loved the story of mysterious lines in the Peruvian desert, ancient art that could only be seen from the sky, a lost civilization with secrets that modern science struggled to unlock. The photographs were stunning, perfect for publication, and the mystery was tantalizing, perfect for speculation and debate. Tourism to Nazca increased dramatically. Small airlines began offering regular flights over the lines, circling the major figures while guides pointed out the spider, the monkey, the hummingbird. Hotels opened to accommodate visitors. Restaurants appeared. The local economy, which had been based on agriculture and small-scale commerce, suddenly had new industry built on ancient art. Not everyone was happy about this. Local people who had lived near the lines for generations without much interest in them now found themselves displaced by commercial development, found that land they'd used for farming or herding was suddenly valuable, suddenly protected, suddenly off limits. Some resented the restrictions, resented being told they couldn't cross the Pampa as their ancestors had done for centuries. And there were the fringe theories. Erich von Däniken, a Swiss author, published a book in 1968 called Chariots of the Gods, proposing that the Nazca Lines were created as landing strips for alien spacecraft, that ancient peoples couldn't possibly have made them on their own, that extraterrestrial visitors must have either created the lines themselves or instructed humans in their construction. This theory, rejected immediately by serious scholars, became wildly popular with general audiences. It fed into broader cultural fascination with UFOs and ancient astronauts, into desires to believe that human history contained hidden chapters, secret visitations, evidence of contact with beings from beyond Earth. The fact that the theory showed profound disrespect for the actual capabilities and achievements of ancient Peruvians didn't diminish its appeal to those who found conventional explanations boring or insufficient. Maria Reicher was furious. She spent years fighting against these pseudoscientific interpretations, arguing passionately that the lines were entirely human achievements, that the Nazca people had the knowledge, the skill, the dedication to create these works without any outside help, that suggesting otherwise was both scientifically wrong and culturally insulting. She gave countless interviews, wrote articles, spoke at conferences, always defending the dignity and capability of the ancient artists who had transformed the desert into canvas. But the debate served a purpose, even if frustrating for serious researchers. It kept the lines in public consciousness, kept people interested, kept funding flowing for preservation and study. And beneath all the speculation, beneath the wild theories and the academic caution, beneath the tourism and the controversy, the lines themselves remained, patient and silent, waiting for better understanding, offering their testimony to anyone willing to study them carefully, to approach them with respect, to remember that they were created by real people with real skills, serving purposes that mattered deeply to their culture, purposes that we might never fully comprehend but can still honour. The most persistent and dramatic theory about the Nazca Lines came from Erich von Däniken, whose 1968 book Chariots of the Gods proposed something that captured imaginations worldwide while horrifying serious archaeologists. He suggested that the lines were runways for alien spacecraft, that the geometric clearings were landing zones, that the animal figures were signals meant to guide extraterrestrial visitors, and that ancient peoples either built them under alien instruction or were attempting to summon back visitors from the stars who had come, helped them, and then departed. This theory rested on a fundamental assumption that would echo through decades of pseudoscientific speculation about ancient monuments, an assumption that Maria Reiche and countless other researchers found deeply offensive. Von Däniken claimed that ancient peoples, particularly those in the Americas, couldn't possibly have created such sophisticated works on their own, that they lacked the intelligence, the technology, the mathematical understanding necessary for such achievements. Therefore, he argued, we must look beyond human capability, must consider intervention by more advanced beings who either did the work themselves or taught ancient peoples how to accomplish what should have been impossible. The archaeological evidence contradicted every element of this theory. The lines weren't runways because they weren't flat or compacted enough to support any vehicle, because many figures included curves and spirals that would be useless for landing anything, because the surface of the pampa, while relatively smooth, contained stones and irregularities that would make it terrible for any kind of aircraft. The geometric clearings weren't landing zones because they varied wildly in size and shape, because they often connected to other figures in ways that made no sense for aviation purposes, because careful study showed they had been modified and added to over centuries, not created all at once as a unified project. And the fundamental assumption that ancient peoples couldn't create the lines collapsed under basic investigation. Researchers demonstrated that the methods used were entirely within the capabilities of the Nazca culture. Joe Nickell, an American investigator, actually recreated one of the figures in the 1980s, using only tools and techniques that would have been available 2,000 years ago. His team used wooden stakes and cord to lay out the design, cleared stones by hand, and created a figure that matched the scale and precision of the ancient works. The experiment proved definitively that no alien technology was necessary, that human hands and human ingenuity were entirely sufficient. But the alien theory, while scientifically bankrupt, pointed to a real contradiction at the heart of the Nazca Lines, a paradox that legitimate researchers also struggle to explain. If the lines weren't meant for gods or aliens, if they weren't runways or signals, if they were created by humans for human purposes, then why make them so large that they can only be appreciated from the sky? Why would a culture invest enormous labour into creating art that they themselves could never properly see, could never fully appreciate, could never experience the way modern observers can from an airplane? This question led to deeper examination of Nazca beliefs and practices. Researchers studied their pottery, which showed supernatural beings and shamanic imagery, suggesting a culture deeply concerned with spiritual matters, with forces beyond the visible world. They studied Nazca textiles, which included flying figures, humans or gods with wings or ribbons that lifted them into the air, hinting that flight might have been part of their mythology, their understanding of how spiritual beings moved through the world. Some scholars propose that the lines weren't meant to be seen from above at all, that their true function lay in walking them, in the act of following the paths as part of religious processions or shamanic journeys. Anthony Aveni, an archaeoastronomer who studied the lines extensively in the 1970s and 80s, argued that the experience of walking the lines, of following them across the desert, of participating in ceremonies that might have taken place on these cleared pathways, was the actual purpose. The visibility from above was secondary or even accidental, a consequence of scale rather than intention. This theory found support in ethnographic studies of Andean religious practices, both ancient and modern. Throughout the Andes, ritual paths called seekers radiated from ceremonial centers, connecting sacred sites, marking spiritual geography, creating networks that organized both physical space and cosmic understanding. Walking these paths was itself a form of worship, a way to connect with supernatural forces, to maintain cosmic order, to ensure the continued functioning of the world. Perhaps the Nazca Lines were Sikhs on a massive scale, religious pathways that needed to be large not for visibility but for their sacred function, for their role in ritual processions that might have included hundreds of participants, for their capacity to connect the human world to the realm of mountains and sky where water came from, where gods dwelled, where the forces that sustained life in the desert originated. But this explanation, while more culturally sensitive and archaeologically sound than alien theories, still left questions unanswered. Not all the lines were pathways that could be walked. Many figures, particularly the animals, consisted of single continuous lines that looped back on themselves, that couldn't be followed as processional routes without crossing and recrossing the same paths multiple times. The trapezoids and geometric clearings might have served as gathering places for ceremonies, but the animal figures seemed to serve some other purpose, something that walking alone couldn't explain. Water emerged as another key to understanding. The Nazca region's survival depended entirely on water, on the underground aquifers that fed their puquios, on the seasonal rivers that descended from the Andes carrying snowmelt, on rain that almost never fell, but when it did transformed the desert briefly into something alive, something green, something that gave hope for survival for another year. David Johnson, a researcher studying the lines in the 1990s, found that many of the lines pointed toward mountains, toward the sources of water that sustained Nazca civilization. He proposed that the lines were prayers written in stone, messages to the mountain gods who controlled rain and rivers, appeals for continued water, promises of devotion and worship in exchange for the life-giving flow that made existence possible in the desert. This water theory explained many features that other theories couldn't account for. It explained why the lines were so large. They needed to be visible to the mountain gods, needed to be impressive enough to merit divine attention, needed to demonstrate the scale of human devotion and need. It explained why the lines continued to be created and maintained for centuries, because the need for water never diminished, because each generation had to renew the covenant with the forces that controlled their survival. It explained why so many lines pointed toward specific peaks. Those mountains were the sources, the sacred places where water originated. And it explained the animal figures. The spider was associated with rain in Andean culture. The hummingbird was connected to fertility and growth. The monkey might represent the humid forests on the eastern side of the Andes where rain was abundant. Each figure could be understood as a symbol in a complex religious language, a message about what the people needed, what they hoped for, what they were willing to offer in exchange for divine favour. But even this elegant theory had limitations. Not all figures fit neatly into water symbolism. Some lines didn't point toward mountains but toward horizon points that had no obvious connection to water sources. The sheer variety of designs, from simple straight lines to complex animal figures to geometric patterns, suggested that the lines might have served multiple purposes, might have accumulated different meanings over the centuries they were being created, might resist any single explanation. The contradiction remained. Legend spoke of messages to gods, of communications with forces beyond human ken, of desperate appeals carved into an unforgiving landscape. Reality showed human hands clearing stones, human minds planning proportions, human feet walking paths, human communities gathering for ceremonies we can barely imagine. Both were true, both were incomplete, and the tension between them revealed something profound about how we understand ancient peoples, about how we balance respect for their beliefs with knowledge of their methods. By the late 20th century, the Nazca Lines had attracted dozens of theories from researchers across multiple disciplines. Each scholar brought their own expertise, their own methodology, their own conviction that they had found the key to understanding what these mysterious figures meant and why they had been created. The debates became heated, sometimes personal, reflecting not just different interpretations of evidence, but fundamentally different approaches to how we can know anything about ancient cultures whose voices have been silent for more than 1,000 years. The astronomical theory, first proposed by Paul Kosok and championed by Maria Reicher, remained influential despite its limitations. Reicher spent decades documenting alignments between lines and celestial events, arguing that the Pampa was essentially a massive calendar, a way for the Nazca people to track the movement of the sun, moon, planets, and stars. She identified lines that pointed to the rising and setting positions of the sun at solstices and equinoxes, argued that certain figures were representations of constellations, suggested that the entire system allowed priests to predict agricultural seasons, to know when to plant and when to harvest. Gerald Hawkins, a British astronomer who had studied Stonehenge, applied computer analysis to the Nazca Lines in the 1960s. He measured the directions of hundreds of lines, calculated what celestial objects they might align with, and ran statistical analyses to determine whether the alignments occurred more frequently than random chance would predict. His conclusion disappointed Riker and her supporters. The lines showed no statistically significant astronomical alignments beyond what would be expected by accident. If the Nazca people were trying to create an astronomical calendar, Hawkins argued, they did a very poor job of it. But Anthony Aveni, studying the lines in the 1970s and 80s, proposed a more nuanced astronomical theory. Perhaps the lines weren't meant to track specific celestial events, but rather to mark the general directions of important horizons, the places where sun and moon rose and set at different times of year, the areas of sky where certain constellations appeared. This approach didn't require precise alignments, didn't demand that every line point exactly to a solstice sunset or a planet's rising. Instead, it suggested that the Nazca people were creating a symbolic landscape that referenced the sky without needing to function as a precision instrument. Johann Reinhard, an anthropologist who had spent years studying Andean mountain worship, offered a different perspective entirely. He argued that the lines were primarily about water, about appealing to the mountain gods who controlled rain and rivers, about creating visible monuments that would convince supernatural forces to continue providing the water that sustained life in the desert. His research showed that throughout the Andes, mountains were seen as living beings, as sources of water and fertility, as places where gods dwelled and from which blessings or curses could flow. The lines, Reinhard proposed, were prayers made visible, pathways that connected ceremonial centers to sacred mountains, figures that represented the animals and plants that depended on water, geometric shapes that might have been gathering places for rituals focused on ensuring continued rainfall and river flow. This theory explained why so many lines pointed toward mountain peaks, why the figures included animals from different ecological zones, why the entire project seemed designed to be visible from above, from the realm of the mountains where gods could see them and judge whether the people's devotion merited continued support. David Johnson expanded this water theory with detailed mapping that showed correlations between line directions and underground water sources. He proposed that the lines marked the locations of aquifers, that they might have served as guides for where to dig wells or construct pukios, that the geometric clearings could have been gathering places for ceremonies celebrating water or pleading for its continued presence. His work combined hydrology with archaeology, trying to understand how ancient people might have encoded practical knowledge about water sources into their monumental art. But other researchers pushed back against single-cause explanations. The Pampa showed evidence of construction over nearly 800 years, from around 200 BCE to 600 CE. It seemed unlikely that such a long-term project would have a single, unchanging purpose, that generation after generation would continue creating lines for exactly the same reason, with exactly the same meaning. Cultures change, beliefs evolve. What started as astronomical observation might later have shifted to water rituals, might eventually have become something else entirely, might have accumulated layers of meaning the way sacred sites often do. Helene Silverman, an archaeologist who conducted extensive excavations at Kawachi, the largest Nazca ceremonial center located near the lines, proposed that understanding the geoglyphs required understanding the broader context of Nazca religion and society. Kawachi was a pilgrimage site, a place where people from different valleys came together for ceremonies, for feasts, for the construction and maintenance of ceremonial mounds and plazas. The lines might have been part of this pilgrimage system, pathways that connected different regions, gathering places for ceremonies, offerings made visible through landscape modification. Her excavations revealed that Kawachi wasn't a city in the normal sense. Few people lived there permanently. Instead, it was a place that came alive during ceremonial seasons, when pilgrims arrived carrying offerings, when priests performed rituals, when communities gathered to affirm shared beliefs and shared identity. The geoglyphs might have served similar functions, might have been created by pilgrims as offerings, might have been maintained by communities as part of their religious obligations, might have been walked during ceremonies that brought people together from across the Nazca region. Giuseppe Orefici, an Italian archaeologist who spent decades excavating at Kawachi, found evidence of ritual offerings buried along some of the lines, pottery vessels and spondylus shells that had been placed deliberately as gifts to gods or ancestors. This suggested that the lines weren't just pathways or astronomical markers, but were themselves sacred, were places where offerings were made, where rituals occurred, where the boundary between human and divine became permeable. Clive Ruggles, an archaeoastronomer from Britain, proposed that we shouldn't expect ancient people to think about astronomy the way modern scientists do. Western astronomy focuses on precise measurements, on mathematical predictions, on separating celestial mechanics from cultural meaning. But for ancient peoples, the sky wasn't a collection of physical objects following mathematical laws. It was alive, meaningful, connected to everything that happened on Earth. The sun wasn't just a star, but a god whose movements affected crops and weather and human fortune. The moon controlled time, marked months, influenced rituals. The stars were ancestors or gods or animals or stories written across the night. From this perspective, the question isn't whether the lines align precisely with astronomical events, but whether they reference the sky in culturally meaningful ways, whether they create connections between Earth and cosmos that would have made sense within Nazca belief systems. A line that points generally toward where the sun rises during planting season might be astronomical without being precise, might encode important seasonal knowledge without functioning as a calendar in the technical sense. Persis Clarkson, studying the lines from an art historical perspective, argued that we should pay more attention to the figures themselves, to what they tell us about Nazca aesthetics, about what they valued visually, about how they chose to represent the world around them. The animal figures were clearly important, clearly took enormous effort to create, clearly meant something beyond mere decoration. They were choosing specific animals, specific poses, specific ways of rendering form, and these choices revealed cultural priorities and symbolic systems. She noted that many of the animals came from different ecological zones. The spider and the hummingbird were from the coast. The monkey came from the Amazon rainforest to the east, the whale from the ocean, the condor from the high mountains. Together they represented the entire world known to the Nazca people, suggested a cosmology that connected desert to ocean to jungle to peaks, that saw all these environments as part of a unified sacred landscape. Carsten Lambers, using new technologies like satellite imagery and computer mapping, discovered hundreds of previously unknown lines and figures, revealing that the system was even more extensive than anyone had realized. His work showed that the geoglyphs weren't confined to one area, but spread across multiple valleys, connected different ceremonial centers, formed networks that must have had social and political significance, as well as religious meaning. Perhaps different communities created different sections. Perhaps the lines marked territorial boundaries or trade routes. Perhaps they served multiple functions simultaneously. All these theories had evidence supporting them. All had weaknesses and gaps. The truth, most researchers eventually concluded, was probably complex, multifaceted, resistant to simple explanation. The lines might have been about astronomy and water and pilgrimage and territory and art and things we haven't even considered, might have meant different things to different people at different times, might have accumulated centuries of meaning the way any sacred landscape does, layer upon layer of interpretation and use and understanding. What united all serious researchers, despite their disagreements, was respect for the people who created the lines, conviction that the Nazca culture possessed genuine sophistication and capability, determination to understand the geoglyphs on their own terms, rather than imposing modern or Western categories of meaning. The debates were intense but productive, each theory pushing researchers to look more carefully, to gather more evidence, to think more deeply about what ancient monuments can tell us and what they forever keep secret. Maria Reicher woke every morning before dawn, when the desert was still cool and the air held a clarity that would burn away within hours under the relentless sun. She dressed simply, sensibly, wearing sturdy shoes for walking and a hat against the heat that would come. Then she went to work on the pampa, measuring, documenting, protecting, continuing the investigation that had consumed her life for more than 5 decades. Her methods were painstaking. She would select a line or figure, photograph it from her stepladder to get the best perspective available from ground level, then walk its entire length with measuring tape and compass, recording every dimension, every angle, every detail of how stones had been cleared and borders had been defined. She created maps by hand, drawing each line to scale, noting its direction, its relationship to other features, its characteristics. When she found pottery shards or other artifacts within a geoglyph, she carefully documented their location, understanding that these objects might help date the construction or reveal something about the ceremonies that had taken place there. She wasn't alone in this work, though she often felt isolated by her dedication. Other researchers came and went, conducting their own studies, bringing new technologies and methodologies, sometimes confirming her findings and sometimes challenging them. In the 1960s, the National Geographic Society funded aerial photography of the entire region, creating detailed maps that revealed the full extent of the line system for the first time. These photographs showed that the geoglyphs covered nearly 200 square miles, contained more than 800 straight lines, 300 geometric figures, and 70 animal and plant designs. The aerial perspective transformed understanding. From the ground, the line seemed random, disconnected, impossible to comprehend as a unified system. From above, patterns emerged. Lines radiated from small hills that might have been ceremonial centres. Trapezoids connected different areas, created pathways between valleys. Geometric figures clustered in certain regions, suggesting that different communities might have been responsible for different sections. The animal figures, which seemed scattered when viewed individually, revealed careful placement when mapped completely, positioned so they didn't overlap, maintained through centuries of construction, even as new lines were added around them. Gerald Hawkins brought computer analysis to bear, writing programs that could calculate celestial alignments, test whether lines pointed towards significant astronomical events, more often than random chance would predict. His negative results, showing no statistically significant astronomical purpose, disappointed Maria Reich but pushed research in new directions, forced scholars to look beyond simple astronomical explanations to consider more complex purposes. Anthony Aveni conducted perhaps the most comprehensive field study in the 1970s and early 80s, spending months on the Pampa with teams of students and colleagues, measuring every line they could find, documenting their characteristics, looking for patterns in how they were distributed and oriented. His work revealed important details about construction methods. Most lines were created by clearing dark surface stones to reveal lighter soil beneath, but some were made by piling stones along the edges of a cleared path, creating low borders that enhanced visibility. The width of lines varied from a few inches to more than 6 feet, suggesting different purposes or different construction periods. Aveni discovered that many lines began at low stone mounds, artificial hills that might have served as ceremonial centres or observation points. These ray centres, as he called them, had dozens of lines radiating from them in different directions, creating starburst patterns visible from above. Walking from a ray centre along one of its lines gave the sensation of moving through sacred space, following a predetermined path towards something important, something meaningful, even if that meaning remained unclear to modern observers. He also found that many of the geometric trapezoids pointed toward mountains or toward the horizon where water sources originated. This supported Johann Reinhardt's water theory, suggested that at least some of the lines had practical as well as religious significance, might have served as guides or references for understanding the landscape, for knowing where water could be found when needed. The animal figures presented particular challenges for investigation. How had ancient artists managed to maintain such perfect proportions when creating designs that spanned hundreds of feet, designs that could only be fully appreciated from heights they couldn't reach? Joe Nichols' experiment in the 1980s demonstrated one possible method. His team created a scale model of a figure, then used a grid system to enlarge it, marking reference points with stakes and connecting them with chords, clearing the full-size version section by section, while constantly checking proportions against the model. The method worked, proved that ancient artists could have created the figures using only available technology, but it also revealed how much planning and skill would have been required, how many people would need to work together, how long the process would take. Helene Silverman's excavations at Kawachi provided crucial context for understanding the lines. The ceremonial centre showed evidence of periodic occupation, large gatherings that occurred during specific seasons, construction and renovation of ceremonial mounds over centuries. Pottery styles found at Kawachi matched those found in association with the lines, confirming that both were products of the same culture during the same time periods. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found at both sites showed that the main construction period for both Kawachi and the lines occurred between 200 BCE and 400 CE, with some continued use and maintenance until around 600 CE. The pottery itself revealed important information. Nazca ceramics were among the finest produced in ancient South America, painted with supernatural beings, shamanic imagery, trophy heads, and geometric patterns. Many vessels showed flying figures, beings with streaming ribbons or elaborate headdresses that suggested movement through the sky. Some showed shamans transforming into animals or birds, consistent with widespread Andean beliefs about spiritual journeys, about the ability of specially trained individuals to travel beyond normal human realms, to communicate with gods or ancestors, to see what ordinary people couldn't see. Giuseppe Orefici's decades of work at Kawachi uncovered ritual offerings that suggested some of the ceremonies performed there involved sacrifice, both of animals and possibly humans, though evidence for human sacrifice was limited and controversial. More common were offerings of pottery, textiles, and spondylus shells, the latter particularly significant because they came from warm Pacific waters far to the north, their presence proof of long-distance trade networks, their use in offerings consistent with their role throughout the Andes as symbols of water, fertility, and communication with divine forces. Modern technology brought new tools to the investigation. Satellite imagery allowed researchers to map the entire system precisely, to discover previously unknown lines and figures, to understand the full scope of what ancient hands had created. Ground-penetrating radar revealed features invisible from the surface, suggested that some areas might contain buried offerings or structures. Drone photography provided flexible aerial perspectives, allowed detailed documentation without the expense and environmental impact of repeated airplane flights. In 2016, researchers from Japan's Yamagata University announced the discovery of more than 100 previously unknown geoglyphs, many of them humanoid figures that were smaller and harder to see from the air than the famous animal designs. These discoveries, made using satellite data and confirmed by field surveys, suggested that the system was even more extensive than previously thought, that decades of study had still not revealed everything the pampa contained. Chemical analysis of the desert varnish on cleared stones provided dating information, confirmed that most lines were indeed ancient, dispelled lingering doubts about their authenticity. Studies of weather patterns and erosion rates helped explain how the lines had survived for 2 millennia in such excellent condition. The extreme dryness of the climate meant almost no rainfall to wash away the clearings. The hard-packed surface resisted wind erosion. The remote location meant limited human disturbance until modern times. But perhaps the most important investigations were those that looked beyond the lines themselves to understand the broader context of Nazca culture. Studies of settlement patterns, agricultural systems, water management, social organization, all contributed to a fuller picture of who the Nazca people were, how they lived, what they valued, what challenges they faced. The lines didn't exist in isolation but were part of a complete cultural system, one expression among many of how this civilization understood their world, their relationship to divine forces, their place in the cosmos. The investigation continued, would always continue, because every answer raised new questions, every discovery revealed new mysteries, every technology made possible new ways of seeing and understanding. But slowly, carefully, through decades of dedicated work by researchers from around the world, the truth was being pieced together, a truth more complex and more human than any single theory could capture, a truth that honoured both the sophistication of ancient achievement and the mystery that would always remain when trying to understand beliefs and purposes that died with the last person who walked these lines in ancient times, knowing with certainty what they meant and why they mattered. The stones told stories to those patient enough to read them. Each rock removed from the pampa's surface to create the lines bore a coating of desert varnish. That dark patina formed over centuries by chemical reactions between minerals and microorganisms, between stone and atmosphere, and the slow, patient work of time. When researchers analysed this varnish using spectrographic methods, they found layers that recorded environmental changes, variations in climate and dust composition, markers that could be dated and compared to establish when stones had been disturbed, when desert surface had been exposed to sky. The results confirmed what pottery analysis and radiocarbon dating had already suggested. Most of the major lines and figures dated to the Nazca culture's fluorescence, between 200 BCE and 600 CE. Some older clearings appeared to predate the Nazca, suggesting that the tradition of creating geoglyphs in this region extended back even further, that the Nazca people inherited this practice from earlier cultures and expanded it to unprecedented scale. A few modifications and additions appeared to date to later periods, evidence that the lines retained significance even after Nazca culture itself collapsed, that subsequent peoples remembered them as sacred, maintained some of them, perhaps added their own contributions to a tradition they didn't fully understand but still respected. Pottery shards scattered across the Pampa provided the most direct link between lines and culture. Nazca ceramics were distinctive, painted in multiple colours with designs that range from geometric patterns to elaborate scenes of supernatural beings, agricultural rituals, warfare and transformation. When fragments of these vessels were found within or near geoglyphs, their style could be dated precisely through comparison with pottery from excavated sites where stratigraphy and radiocarbon dating established clear chronologies. The pottery revealed something else important. Many vessels showed offerings being made, ceremonies being performed, shamanic rituals involving transformation and spiritual journey. Trophy heads appeared frequently, severed human heads that might have been war prizes or sacrificial offerings, evidence of a culture that included violence alongside beauty, that saw death as part of the sacred cycle, that believed proper rituals could harness even destruction toward maintaining cosmic balance. Some pots showed the actual landscape of the Nazca region, depicted mountains and valleys and rivers in stylized form, placed supernatural beings in these landscapes, suggested that the natural and divine realms were not separate but interpenetrated, that gods dwelt in mountains, that spiritual forces moved through water and earth and sky. If this was how the Nazca people understood their world, then the geoglyphs made perfect sense as attempts to communicate with these forces, to mark sacred geography, to create visible monuments that would speak to gods who controlled survival in the desert. Textiles provided another window into Nazca beliefs and capabilities. Found in burials and offering caches, these woven fabrics displayed technical mastery that rivaled the best textile traditions anywhere in the ancient world. Some pieces contained hundreds of threads per inch, created patterns so complex that modern weavers struggle to replicate them. The designs paralleled those on pottery, but often included even more detail, more elaborate depictions of supernatural beings, flying figures, shamanic transformations. Particularly significant were textiles showing figures suspended in air, beings with streaming ribbons or elaborate costumes that suggested flight or spiritual ascension. These images hinted that Nazca cosmology included concepts of spiritual flight, of souls or shamans travelling beyond normal human limitations, of communication with forces that dwelt above the earthly realm. If shamans believed they could fly in spiritual form, if priests claimed to journey to the sky to communicate with gods, then creating images visible primarily from above takes on different meaning, becomes not paradoxical, but logical. A way to create art for the perspective of spiritual vision rather than normal earthly sight. The puquios, those remarkable underground aqueducts that still function today, provided evidence of Nazca engineering capabilities and priorities. These spiral wells, descending into the earth in gradually declining curves, accessed underground water sources and directed flow to fields and settlements. Building them required sophisticated understanding of hydrology, of geology, of mathematics and surveying. If the Nazca people could engineer these complex water systems, they certainly possessed the technical knowledge required to create the geoglyphs, to maintain straight lines over miles, to scale up designs with mathematical precision. The puquios also confirmed what many researchers suspected about the central importance of water to Nazca culture. In a region where rain fell perhaps once a decade, where surface rivers flowed only seasonally, where survival depended entirely on accessing underground aquifers, water wasn't just important, it was everything. It was life itself. The gods who controlled water were the most powerful forces imaginable, and appealing to them, honouring them, maintaining their favour would be the most important religious duty any community could undertake. At Kawachi, excavations revealed offering caches buried in ceremonial contexts, deposits that provided direct evidence of Nazca ritual practices. Spondylus shells, brought from Ecuador's warm coastal waters, were found throughout the site, their presence evidence of long-distance trade and of their sacred significance. In Andean belief systems, Spondylus was associated with water, with fertility, with communication between human and divine realms. Finding these shells buried as offerings at Kawachi and along some of the lines suggested that water rituals, appeals to rain-bringing forces, were indeed central to Nazca religion. Trophy heads, both actual human skulls and ceramic representations, appeared in offering contexts and in pottery imagery. This suggested that warfare or ritual violence played a role in Nazca society, that taking heads might have been part of religious practice or social competition, that blood and death were seen as necessary offerings to maintain cosmic balance. Some researchers proposed that the lines might have been gathering places for ceremonies that included sacrifice, that blood offerings might have been made on these clearings, that the desert itself became a sacred space sanctified by ritual violence. But the evidence also showed a culture of remarkable artistic achievement and peaceful pursuits. Musical instruments found in burials, panpipes made from ceramic or bone, suggested a people who valued beauty, who created music, who celebrated life alongside their awareness of death. Agricultural tools, fishing implements, weaving equipment, all painted and decorated with care, all showing attention to aesthetics even in utilitarian objects, revealed a culture that found meaning in everyday activities, that saw beauty and sacredness in ordinary life. The settlements themselves, modest adobe structures built in valley bottoms near water sources, showed a culture that was not focused on monumental architecture for habitation. Unlike other ancient civilizations that built elaborate palaces and massive urban centres, the Nazca invested their monumental efforts into the landscape itself, into the puquios that brought water, into the geoglyphs that covered the pampa. This suggested different priorities, different ways of expressing cultural identity and religious devotion, different conceptions of what endured and what mattered. Skeletal remains from Nazca burials showed a population adapted to their harsh environment, but also suffering from nutritional stress, evidence that survival in the desert was never easy, that drought and hardship were constant threats, that the abundance suggested by their beautiful ceramics and textiles coexisted with vulnerability, with the awareness that climate could change, water could fail, that their entire civilization existed on the edge of sustainability. Analysis of ancient climate records from ice cores and lake sediments revealed that the Nazca period included significant environmental changes, droughts that lasted for years, possibly decades, El Niño events that brought destructive flooding alternating with profound dry spells. The Nazca people lived through climate instability that would challenge any civilization, and their response was to build waterworks, to appeal to mountain gods, to create monuments that would demonstrate their devotion and hopefully ensure continued divine favour. The evidence taken together painted a picture of a sophisticated culture facing environmental challenges, a people who responded with engineering ingenuity and religious dedication, who created beauty in a harsh landscape, who left monuments that would outlast their civilization by more than 1,000 years. The lines weren't the work of aliens or lost super-civilizations, but of real humans with remarkable capabilities, facing real problems, creating real solutions expressed through the religious and artistic frameworks that gave their lives meaning. Every fragment of pottery, every scrap of textile, every carefully analysed stone, every buried offering, every excavated structure added another piece to the puzzle, another glimpse into lives lived long ago in the shadow of mountains that held both promise and threat, both water and drought, both survival and the constant possibility of catastrophic failure. The evidence didn't answer every question, but it grounded speculation in reality, honoured the actual people who walked this desert, who cleared these stones, who created these images, who believed with profound conviction that what they were doing mattered, that their work would please the gods, that their efforts would ensure continued life in a place where life itself was the greatest miracle. As research progressed through the late 20th and early 21st centuries, investigators began to realize that the famous animal figures, the iconic images that appeared in every documentary and travel guide, represented only a small fraction of the geoglyphs on the pampa. The lines themselves, those straight clearings that stretched for miles across the desert, vastly outnumbered the figurative designs. There were more than 800 straight lines compared to only 70 animal and plant figures. And then there were the trapezoids, those massive geometric clearings that widened as they extended across the landscape, covering more total area than all the other features combined. This numerical reality suggested something researchers had overlooked in their focus on the dramatic animal images. The straight lines and geometric shapes weren't just support features for the animals, weren't merely pathways connecting more important figures. They were the primary elements, the foundation of the entire system, and understanding them was crucial to understanding the geoglyphs' true purpose. Anton Aveni's careful surveys revealed patterns in how these lines and trapezoids were distributed and oriented. Many of the straight lines radiated from central points, low stone mounds that might have been ceremonial centres or gathering places. These ray centres, as he called them, had dozens of lines extending outward in different directions, creating patterns visible from above, but also defining pathways that could be walked, routes that connected the centre to distant points on the horizon, to mountains, to valleys, to other ceremonial locations. The trapezoids showed different patterns. They tended to be oriented towards sources of water, toward the mountains where streams originated, toward underground aquifer locations. Some researchers proposed that they were gathering places for ceremonies focused on water, that communities would assemble on these clearings to perform rituals appealing for rain or celebrating the arrival of water in irrigation channels, that the expanding shapes symbolized the hoped-for increase in water flow, the widening of abundance spreading from divine sources in the mountains down to human settlements in the valleys. But there was something else, something that only became clear when researchers started looking at the lines not as isolated features, but as a system, a network that connected different parts of the Nazca landscape in complex ways. The lines weren't random. They linked settlements to ceremonial centres, connected different valleys, created pathways that would allow pilgrims to travel between sacred locations, established a sacred geography that organised physical space according to religious and social principles. This realisation connected the Nazca Lines to broader Andean traditions that had been documented in other regions and time periods. The Inca, who rose to power centuries after the Nazca culture collapsed, used a system called seque, radiating lines that extended from the capital city of Cusco to sacred sites throughout their empire. These seque were not physical pathways visible from the sky, but conceptual lines, imaginary connections that organised space, defined social relationships, structured religious obligations, and created a comprehensive map of sacred geography. Each seque was maintained by a specific social group, who had responsibility for the shrines and sacred sites along that line, who performed rituals at designated times, who kept the system functioning as part of their social and religious duties. The system was incredibly complex, with more than 300 shrines organised into 41 sec, each with specific purposes, specific deities, specific ritual requirements. If the Nazca Lines represented an earlier version of this tradition, if they were physical manifestations of the same organising principle that the Inca would later use in purely conceptual form, then their purpose became clearer. They weren't just messages to gods or astronomical calendars or water appeals, though they might have included all those functions. They were a way of organising society, of defining relationships between communities, of creating shared religious obligations that bound different groups together into a coherent culture. Walking a line wouldn't just be a religious act, but also a social one, a way of affirming identity, of maintaining relationships with other groups, of participating in a shared system that gave meaning to the entire Nazca region. The animal figures might have been markers along these lines, symbols that identified specific seque or indicated the purpose of rituals performed there, reference points in a sacred geography that everyone understood but that outsiders, lacking the cultural knowledge to decode the symbols, could not comprehend. This interpretation explained why the lines continued to be created and maintained for centuries. Each generation had to participate in the system, had to fulfill their obligations, had to walk the paths and perform the ceremonies that maintained cosmic order. The lines weren't finished projects but ongoing commitments, perpetual work that bound communities to landscape and to each other, that created continuity across generations, that gave physical form to social relationships and religious beliefs. It also explained the sheer scale of the undertaking. If hundreds of social groups each maintained their own sections, if creating and walking lines was a regular part of ceremonial life, then the accumulation of 800 lines over 6 or 7 centuries became not mysterious, but inevitable. Not evidence of impossible effort, but simply the natural result of sustained cultural practice integrated into every aspect of life. Giuseppe Orefici's work at Cahuachi revealed additional complexity. The ceremonial centre showed evidence of periodic occupation, large gatherings that occurred during specific seasons, construction projects that brought together workers from different valleys. Pottery styles from multiple regions appeared at the site, evidence that Kawachi served as a place where diverse groups came together, where regional differences were temporarily set aside in favour of shared religious practice and social interaction. What research had revealed was that the Nazca Lines were far more complex, far more socially integrated, far more central to everyday life than anyone had initially suspected. They weren't anomalies, weren't mysterious outliers that demanded extraordinary explanations. They were expressions of ordinary Andean religious practice, taken to extraordinary scale, made permanent where most such traditions left no physical trace, preserved by desert dryness where elsewhere erosion and vegetation would have erased all evidence within decades of abandonment. The mystery remained, would always remain in important ways, but it was now a human mystery, grounded in real culture, connected to actual lives and beliefs and practices. The lines spoke to us across centuries, whispered in a language we could barely understand, but what they said was fundamentally about being human, about creating meaning in a harsh landscape, about finding ways to survive through cooperation and shared belief, about leaving marks that would endure long after the people themselves had vanished, had become memories, had finally become nothing but questions that future generations would struggle to answer. Around 500 CE, the climate began to shift. The subtle changes would have been noticed first by the priests, by the people who maintained the sacred calendar, by those who watched the mountains anxiously for signs of snowpack that would feed rivers during the dry season, by farmers who depended on precise timing to coax crops from irrigated fields in the desert. The rains, already rare, became even less frequent. The rivers that descended from the Andes carrying snowmelt began to flow for shorter periods, receded earlier in the season, carried less water than memory recorded. Drought wasn't new to the Nazca people. Their entire civilization had been built on the premise that water was scarce, precious, requiring careful management and religious devotion to maintain. Their puquios were designed precisely for this reality, tapping underground aquifers that persisted even when surface water disappeared. Their religious practices centered on appealing to mountain gods who controlled rain and snowfall, on performing the ceremonies that would maintain divine favor and ensure continued water flow. But this drought was different. It persisted year after year, decade after decade, moving beyond the normal cycles of wet and dry seasons that everyone understood, that agriculture and society were adapted to handle. Ice core data from Andean glaciers, analysed centuries later by climatologists, revealed that the 6th century CE experienced a significant climate shift, a prolonged dry period that affected the entire region, that stressed civilizations throughout Peru, that challenged societies that had flourished for centuries but now faced environmental conditions their ancestors hadn't designed for. The evidence of Nazca's response appears in changing pottery styles, in shifting settlement patterns, in modifications to Kawachi and other ceremonial centres, and in the lines themselves. New geoglyphs were created during this period, often overlapping or intersecting older ones, suggesting urgency, suggesting that the careful planning and precise execution of earlier centuries was giving way to something more desperate, more immediate, more focused on addressing crisis rather than maintaining tradition. At Kawachi, construction activity intensified before finally ceasing altogether. New mounds were built, existing structures were renovated, offering caches became more frequent and more elaborate, filled with precious goods that represented enormous investment of resources, suggesting communities pouring their wealth into religious appeals, hoping that sufficient devotion, sufficient sacrifice, sufficient demonstration of faith would convince the gods to restore the water that was disappearing. Social stress accompanied environmental crisis, evidence of violence increased, trophy heads appeared more frequently in archaeological contexts, suggesting warfare or ritual sacrifice intensified as different groups competed for diminishing resources or as religious authorities demanded more extreme measures to appease gods who seemed to have withdrawn their favour. Skeletal evidence from this period shows increased nutritional stress, signs that people were struggling to get enough food, that children and adults alike were suffering the effects of scarcity. The lines themselves became different. Some continued to be maintained, evidence that ritual obligations persisted, that communities still believed the ceremonies mattered, that devotion to the gods remained central even as conditions worsened. But new construction changed in character, became less precise, less carefully executed, sometimes overlapping older figures without the careful respect for existing work that had characterized earlier periods. The animal figures, those elaborate designs that had required such planning and skill, stopped being created. The focus shifted entirely to lines and geometric shapes, perhaps because they were simpler, faster to create, or perhaps because their purpose, their connection to water and mountains and appeals for divine intervention became the only thing that mattered when survival itself was at stake. The lines remained. Unlike the adobe buildings that melted back into earth, unlike the organic materials that decayed, unlike the social structures and religious beliefs that died with the people who held them, the lines persisted. They weathered the drought that ended Nazca civilization. They survived the centuries that followed, witnessed the rise and fall of other cultures, saw Spanish conquest and colonial rule, endured into the modern era when airplanes would finally reveal their full scope, to eyes that could see what their creators perhaps imagined gods seeing, what shamans in spiritual flight might have witnessed, what the mountain deities the lines were meant to appeal to would have observed from their distant peaks. The turning point wasn't dramatic in the way battles or conquests are dramatic, wasn't marked by a specific date or event that everyone recognized as the moment everything changed. It was gradual, subtle, recognized only in hindsight when researchers studied climate data and settlement patterns and realized that a civilization had ended not with violence but with absence, not with destruction but with departure, not with catastrophe but with the simple, terrible reality that the water stopped coming, the gods stopped answering, and survival required leaving behind everything ancestors had built, everything that had defined identity and purpose, everything that made them who they were. The immediate consequence of prolonged drought was fragmentation. The Nazca region, which had been unified by shared religious practices, by pilgrimage to common ceremonial centres, by the maintenance of geoglyphs that required cooperation across communities, began to break apart into smaller, more isolated groups. When water became scarce, when survival became the paramount concern, the bonds that held society together weakened, stretched thin by competition for diminishing resources, by the failure of religious practices that had promised to maintain cosmic order but couldn't prevent environmental catastrophe. Archaeological evidence shows this fragmentation clearly. Pottery styles that had been relatively uniform across the Nazca region during the culture's peak began to diverge. Different valleys developed their own variations, their own design preferences, suggesting reduced contact between communities, suggesting that the shared identity that once defined Nazca culture was giving way to more localized identities based on immediate survival needs, rather than regional religious and social integration. Others proposed that the trophy heads weren't primarily about warfare but about intensified religious practice, desperate attempts to restore cosmic balance through increasingly extreme rituals, through sacrifice that ancient belief systems held was necessary to maintain the flow of divine favor. Blood offerings, human sacrifice, the taking of heads might have been seen as the most powerful appeals available when ordinary ceremonies had failed to bring the rain, when normal devotion had proven insufficient to prevent catastrophe. Cahuachi's abandonment as a major ceremonial center didn't mean the complete end of religious practice in the region, but it did mean the end of the pilgrimage system that had united Nazca culture, the end of the large gatherings that had brought diverse communities together, the end of the shared ceremonies that had affirmed common identity and purpose. Without Cahuachi, without the focal point that had organized religious and social life, the culture fragmented further, each community forced to maintain its own relationship with the divine, to create its own ceremonies, to find its own ways of coping with crisis. Some communities continued to maintain sections of the geoglyphs near their settlements, continued to walk the lines and perform ceremonies that ancestors had performed, perhaps believing that persistence would eventually be rewarded, that the gods would notice continued devotion and restore the water that had vanished. Other sections of the pampa fell into neglect, no longer maintained, slowly beginning the weathering process that would have erased them entirely, if not for the extreme dryness of the desert, if not for the fact that rain almost never fell to wash away the clearings, that vegetation almost never grew to obscure the patterns. But something unexpected happened as well. Even as Nazca culture collapsed in its heartland, some of its traditions, some of its knowledge, some of its practices spread outward, carried by migrants who left the drought-stricken region seeking survival elsewhere, carried by traders who maintained networks even as political unity dissolved, carried by the simple fact that good ideas, effective technologies, beautiful art have a way of persisting, of being adopted by others, of surviving even when the culture that created them fails. The Puquio technology, those remarkable spiral wells that accessed underground water, spread throughout the southern coast of Peru. Communities that hadn't invented the system themselves recognized its effectiveness, adopted it, maintained it, passed the knowledge to their descendants. Some puquios built during the Nazca period are still in use today, still bringing water to desert farms, still functioning after more than 1,500 years, testament to the engineering skill of people who understood their environment intimately, who created solutions that didn't just work but endured. Pottery styles evolved rather than disappearing. The Nazca tradition of polychrome ceramics, of painting vessels with multiple colours and elaborate designs, influenced later cultures throughout the region. The Wari Empire, which rose to power several centuries after Nazca collapse, incorporated elements of Nazca art into their own traditions, preserved aspects of the aesthetic even as they created something new, something adapted to different circumstances and different purposes. The consequence of Nazca civilization's collapse wasn't oblivion but transformation. The culture that had created the lines, that had built Kawachi, that had produced such magnificent pottery and textiles, that had engineered water systems in the desert, that culture ended as a distinct entity, ceased to exist as a coherent system with its own identity and practices. But its people persisted, carrying forward knowledge and traditions that would be adapted and transformed and incorporated into new cultural systems that would influence the region for centuries to come. The lines remained as testament, as evidence of what had been achieved, as monuments to human capability and human faith. They remained as questions, as mysteries that would perplex future generations, as problems that would challenge researchers who tried to understand what they meant and why they had been created. They remained as beauty, as art that transcended its original purpose, that spoke to something universal in human experience even when the specific cultural context that created them had vanished. And they remained as warnings, though centuries would pass before anyone would understand them as such, warnings about what happens when climate changes, when water fails, when environmental conditions that societies depend on shift beyond their capacity to adapt, when the systems that sustained civilization prove inadequate to new circumstances. The Nazca people didn't fail because they lacked intelligence or capability or dedication. They failed because the climate changed in ways they couldn't control, because environmental forces beyond human influence transformed their landscape into something their culture couldn't survive. The fall of Nazca civilization was also a rise of resilience, of adaptation, of the human capacity to survive even catastrophic change, to carry forward what matters, to find new ways of living when old ways become impossible. The people didn't disappear. They endured, transformed, became part of new stories even as their own story ended, left traces in language and tradition and genetic heritage that connected past to present in ways that simple historical narrative couldn't capture, in ways that reminded us that civilizations are never as discrete as we imagine, that endings are always also beginnings, that what falls also rises in different form, transformed but recognizable to those who look carefully enough to see continuity beneath the surface of change. The Nazca Lines influenced human understanding in ways their creators could never have anticipated, shaped modern consciousness about ancient achievement, transformed how we think about pre-Columbian civilizations, sparked debates that extended far beyond archaeology into broader questions about human capability, cultural sophistication, and our relationship to the past. The impact wasn't immediate but accumulated over decades as knowledge spread, as photographs circulated, as researchers published findings and tourists visited the Pampa, and the world gradually came to understand what existed in the Peruvian desert. The Nazca Lines challenged these assumptions directly. Here was undeniable evidence of sophisticated planning, of mathematical precision, of artistic vision, of organizational capability that rivaled anything achieved by supposedly more advanced civilizations. The sheer scale of the undertaking, the precision of the execution, the complexity of the overall system forced even, skeptical observers to acknowledge that ancient Peruvian cultures possessed genuine sophistication, that they had achieved things that required intelligence, skill, dedication, and cultural systems capable of sustaining multi-generational projects. This recognition contributed to broader re-evaluation of pre-Columbian American achievements that accelerated through the late 20th century. Archaeologists working throughout the Americas documented evidence of complex societies, sophisticated agricultural systems, remarkable artistic traditions, mathematical and astronomical knowledge that equaled or exceeded contemporary achievements in other parts of the world. The Nazca Lines became emblematic of this revised understanding, visual proof that ancient American peoples had created monumental works that demanded respect, that challenged anyone to explain how supposedly primitive cultures could achieve such remarkable things. The lines also influenced how we think about human relationship to landscape, about how cultures transform environment, not just for practical purposes, but for religious, social, and artistic expression. Most monumental architecture focuses on building up, on creating structures that rise above the landscape, that announce presence through vertical dominance. The Nazca Lines represented a different approach, modification of landscape itself to create art at a scale that matched the environment, that worked with desert topography rather than trying to overcome it, that demonstrated you could transform vast areas through patient labour without needing to construct buildings or monuments in the traditional sense. This understanding influenced modern land art movements, inspired artists like Robert Smithson and Michael Heiser, who created large-scale works that modified landscape, that used earth and stone and natural materials to create art that existed at environmental scale, that could only be fully appreciated from aerial perspectives or through documentation that allowed viewers to comprehend scope that couldn't be perceived from any single ground-level viewpoint. The Nazca Lines became a reference point for these artists, an ancient precedent for contemporary practices, proof that humans had been thinking about art at landscape scale for millennia. The lines shaped tourism in Peru, became one of the country's most important archaeological attractions alongside Machu Picchu and the Inca ruins of Cusco. Airlines developed regular flights over Nazca specifically for sightseeing, created an industry that brought thousands of tourists annually, generated revenue for local communities, created economic value that helped justify continued preservation and protection. This tourism brought its own challenges, increased traffic over fragile desert surfaces, brought development pressures that threatened the very features people came to see, but it also created stakeholders who benefited from the line's existence, who had economic incentive to support preservation. The impact extended into popular culture in ways both helpful and problematic. The alien runway theories, while scientifically baseless and culturally disrespectful, made the lines famous, brought them into public consciousness through books and television programs that reached audiences who might never have encountered serious archaeological literature. This fame was double-edged, inspired genuine interest in some people, while spreading misinformation to others, created both support for preservation and headaches for researchers who had to constantly fight against pseudo-scientific interpretations. Educational impacts were profound. The Nazca Lines became standard content in world history curricula, appeared in textbooks alongside pyramids and Stonehenge and the Great Wall as examples of ancient monumental achievement. Students around the world learned about the geoglyphs, developed awareness of pre-Columbian American civilizations, encountered evidence that sophisticated cultures had flourished in the Americas long before European contact. This educational exposure helped combat lingering colonial narratives, helped build appreciation for Indigenous American achievements, contributed to more balanced understanding of human history that didn't privilege European experiences or achievements. The lines influenced how archaeologists approach landscape archaeology, inspired methodologies that look beyond individual sites or structures to understand how cultures organized and understood entire regions. The recognition that the Nazca geoglyphs formed a system, that they connected different locations and served social as well as religious functions, encouraged similar approaches elsewhere, led to discoveries of other landscape-scale features that had been missed when researchers focused only on buildings and settlements. The lines influenced environmental consciousness as well, became cautionary tales about climate change and cultural vulnerability. The story of Nazca civilization's collapse due to prolonged drought resonated in an era of increasing concern about anthropogenic climate change, served as historical example of how environmental shifts could undermine even sophisticated societies, reminded modern peoples that we aren't immune to ecological forces, that civilizations built on unsustainable resource use or vulnerable to climate shifts face existential risks regardless of technological sophistication. The preservation challenges the lines faced, threats from development and tourism and simple neglect, became case studies in heritage management, inspired international cooperation on archaeological preservation, contributed to development of best practices for protecting fragile sites while still allowing public access and study. UNESCO's designation of the lines as World Heritage Site set precedents for how international communities could work together to preserve shared human heritage, established frameworks that would be applied to threatened sites around the world. The impact continues, evolves with each generation that encounters the lines, with each new technology that allows different ways of studying them, with each researcher who brings fresh perspectives to old questions. The lines shape how we think about ancient achievement, about cultural sophistication, about human relationship to landscape, about the persistence of art and meaning across centuries that separate creation from observation. They remind us that history contains surprises, that ancient peoples accomplished things we're still trying to fully understand, that every culture has contributed to human heritage in ways both practical and profound, that the monuments ancestors left behind speak to us still if we're willing to listen with respect and wonder. Imagine being 12 years old in the Nazca Valley around 300 CE, watching as adults from your community gather for the annual ceremony of line maintenance. Your parents wake you before dawn, while stars still crowd the desert sky and cold air makes you pull your woven cloak tighter around your shoulders. You eat a quick breakfast of quinoa porridge, then join the procession of families walking toward the pampa, toward one of the straight lines that radiates from the low stone mound near your village, toward the work that your people have performed for as long as anyone can remember. The priests lead the way, wearing elaborate headdresses that mark their status, carrying offerings that will be buried along the line, pottery vessels filled with maize beer that will be poured onto the cleared earth, spondylus shells brought from distant oceans that will be placed as gifts to the mountain gods who control water. Behind them walk the adults, men and women both, carrying baskets and tools, ready to clear away any stones that have encroached on the line during the year since the last maintenance, ready to redefine the borders that wind and weather have softened. You walk with the other children, watching, learning, understanding that someday you will be responsible for this work, that maintaining the lines is not just religious obligation but social duty, part of what defines your community, part of what connects you to the generations who came before and those who will come after. Your grandmother has told you stories about the line, about how it points toward the mountain where your people's ancestors are buried, how walking it brings you closer to those who have died, how the ceremonies performed here have kept water flowing in the village well, have ensured that crops grow and children are born healthy, and the world continues as it should. The work is hard but communal. Adults move along the line in organized groups, each person responsible for a section, clearing away the dark oxidized stones that have rolled onto the lighter surface, carrying them to the borders where they're carefully placed to maintain straight edges. You help with smaller stones, learn the technique of clearing without disturbing the underlying surface too much, discover how to judge which stones belong to the border and which have blown in from elsewhere. The sun rises higher, heat builds, but the work continues with regular breaks for water and rest and food that families have brought. There's conversation, laughter, gossip about neighbours, and speculation about whether this year's rains will be better than last year's meagre offerings. There's singing, old songs that everyone knows, that your grandmother says her grandmother taught her, songs about mountains and water and the gods who dwell in high places where snow never melts. By afternoon, the line gleams fresh in the desert sun, its borders redefined, its surface cleared, its appearance renewed. The priests perform a ceremony, pouring beer onto the earth, burying offerings, speaking words in a formal dialect you don't quite understand but whose rhythms you find comforting, familiar from dozens of previous ceremonies you've attended. Everyone walks the length of the line together, a procession that reaffirms the work, that sanctifies the space, that fulfills the obligations your people owe to the ancestors and the gods. This scene, imagined but grounded in archaeological evidence and ethnographic comparison with Andean practices, captures something that gets lost in academic debates about astronomical alignments, or water symbolism, or pilgrimage networks. The lines weren't just abstract monuments or mysterious messages, they were part of lived experience, woven into the fabric of ordinary life, maintained by real people who had families and friends and daily concerns, who worried about harvests and water and children's health, who found meaning in the work not because they were mysterious ancients with incomprehensible beliefs, but because they were humans doing what humans do, creating rituals and monuments that expressed their understanding of how the world worked and their place within it. Consider the artist who first conceived of one of the great animal figures, the hummingbird perhaps, that magnificent design that stretches across hundreds of feet of desert. This person had to possess not just artistic vision, but mathematical understanding, had to know how to scale up a small design to massive proportions, had to plan the layout carefully enough that workers clearing stones according to instructions would create something recognizable from the sky, from the perspective of gods or ancestors or shamanic spirits. Consider the old people who could remember how things used to be, who had watched climate slowly changing, who remembered when certain springs flowed stronger, when certain rituals seemed more effective, who carried the accumulated wisdom of lifetimes spent observing patterns in weather and water and the responses of gods to human appeal. These elders held authority based on experience, were consulted when decisions needed to be made, passed knowledge to younger generations who would carry it forward after the elders themselves had joined the ancestors in the mountains. Think about the children, like the 12-year-old we imagined, who learned by watching and participating, who absorbed through repeated experience what these lines meant, how to maintain them, why they mattered. For these children, the lines weren't mysterious or strange. They were normal, part of the world they'd always known, as familiar as the mountains on the horizon or the sound of wind across the pampa. And finally, consider the last generation, the people who lived through Nazca culture's collapse, who watched their civilization fragment, who had to make impossible decisions about whether to leave ancestral lands or stay and risk starvation, who maintained some lines even as others fell into neglect, who tried to preserve what they could of traditions and knowledge even as circumstances forced adaptations their ancestors would barely recognize. These weren't ancient mysteries, but human beings facing human problems, responding with human emotions and human ingenuity and human faith. They loved and feared and hoped and struggled and created and failed and persevered, and eventually died, leaving behind monuments that would outlast memory, that would speak to descendants who wouldn't know their names, wouldn't understand their language, wouldn't share their beliefs, but might still recognize something universal in what they had accomplished, might still see in cleared stones and defined borders and massive figures the eternal human need to create meaning, to leave marks that say we were here, we mattered, we understood something about the world that we wanted to preserve, to share, to offer to whatever forces or peoples or futures might eventually see what we had made. Maria Riker faced opposition throughout her decades of work protecting and studying the Nazca Lines. Not opposition from academics or skeptics or pseudoscientific theorists, though those existed and frustrated her, but practical, immediate opposition from people who wanted to use the pampa for purposes that would destroy the geoglyphs, who saw the desert as empty space available for exploitation, who dismissed ancient art as irrelevant to modern needs. In the 1950s and 60s, as Peru modernized and developed its infrastructure, the desert near Nazca seemed ideal for various projects. The flat terrain made it attractive for road construction. The remoteness suggested it could accommodate industrial facilities without bothering urban populations. The fact that the area was used for nothing visible, that no crops grew there, that no towns occupied the space, made it seem available, neglected, waiting for productive use. Rishi fought against proposal after proposal. When engineers wanted to build a highway straight across the pampa, cutting through multiple geoglyphs, she lobbied officials, wrote letters, gave interviews, explained repeatedly that they would be destroying irreplaceable archaeological treasures for short-term convenience. The highway was eventually routed around the most sensitive areas, a partial victory that required years of advocacy and left her exhausted, frustrated by how difficult it was to make people care about ancient lines they couldn't properly see, whose value seemed abstract compared to the concrete benefits of modern transportation. Local residents sometimes resented the restrictions Riker advocated, farmers who had traditionally driven livestock across certain sections of the pampa found themselves told these areas were now protected, that they needed to find alternate routes. Land that families had considered available for expansion or use suddenly became restricted, valuable not for what it could provide them, but for marks on the ground that their ancestors had ignored for generations. This created tensions between preservation and practical need, between respecting the past and accommodating the present. The Peruvian Air Force used portions of the desert for training exercises, their vehicles leaving tire tracks that crossed ancient lines, their activities disturbing surfaces that had remained undisturbed for centuries. Riker confronted military officials, armed with cameras and determination, documented damage and demanded accountability. The military, not accustomed to being challenged by a civilian woman, initially dismissed her concerns, but she persisted, gained support from academics and government officials who recognized the line's importance, eventually secured agreements that designated certain areas as off-limits to military activities. Mining interests saw the desert as potential source of minerals and resources. The very stones that covered the Pampa's surface had value as construction material. Proposals emerged for quarrying operations that would have stripped the desert, removed the dark, oxidized rocks, destroyed geoglyphs in the process of extracting raw materials. Riker fought these proposals too, arguing that the archaeological value far exceeded any temporary economic benefit from resource extraction, that destroying the lines would be cultural vandalism without justification. Tourism itself created opposition, though of a different sort. As the lines became famous, as flights over the Pampa became popular, local entrepreneurs saw opportunity. Hotels, restaurants, tour operators all wanted to maximize access, to bring more visitors, to generate more revenue. But increased access meant increased impact. More flights meant more noise, more fuel emissions, more disturbance to the desert environment. More tourists meant more people wanting to walk on the Pampa, to get close-up photographs, to touch the ancient clearings. Riker advocated for controlled access, for regulations that would protect the lines while still allowing responsible tourism. This put her at odds with business interests who wanted fewer restrictions, who argued that excessive protection would kill tourism, would eliminate the economic benefits that justified preservation efforts. Finding balance between access and protection became ongoing negotiation, required compromises that satisfied no one completely, but preserved the lines while allowing people to experience them. Pseudoscientific theories created another form of opposition. Erich von Däniken's alien runway proposal and similar ideas attracted followers who wanted to visit Nazca not to appreciate ancient human achievement, but to seek evidence of extraterrestrial contact. These believers sometimes conducted unauthorized investigations, disturbed protected areas looking for alien artifacts, spread misinformation that made serious research harder, turned the lines into spectacle rather than treating them as archaeological treasures deserving respect. Riker spent enormous energy fighting against these theories, arguing passionately that they disrespected the actual people who created the lines, that they robbed ancient Peruvians of credit for genuine achievement, that they promoted cultural chauvinism by suggesting indigenous peoples couldn't have accomplished sophisticated works without outside help. Her opposition to alien theories made her unpopular with some segments of the public who found conventional explanations boring, who preferred mysterious narratives about ancient astronauts to patient archaeological research and evidence-based conclusions. Within the archaeological community, opposition took subtler forms. Some colleagues questioned her methods, argued that her astronomical theories weren't supported by rigorous analysis, suggested that her passion for the lines had led her to see patterns that weren't really there. These debates were professional, based on legitimate scientific disagreements, but they still felt like opposition to Riker, who had devoted her life to the lines, who knew them more intimately than anyone else, who resented having her work questioned by researchers who spent weeks or months studying what she'd spent decades protecting and documenting. But the opposition also revealed how important preservation was, how easily the lines could have been destroyed, how their survival required active protection rather than passive hope that people would recognize their value and voluntarily preserve them. Without opposition, there would have been no need for advocates. Without threat, there would have been no urgency. Without resistance, there would have been no test of commitment, no measure of how much people were willing to sacrifice to protect ancient art that served no practical purpose, that generated no immediate benefit, that mattered only because history mattered, because human achievement deserved preservation, because some things were worth saving simply because losing them would diminish us all. In the 1990s and early 2000s, something shifted in how Peru and the wider world understood the Nazca Lines. What had been primarily the concern of archaeologists and a few dedicated preservationists became a broader cultural phenomenon, a symbol of indigenous achievement, a source of national pride, a focus of renewed investigation that combined traditional methods with new technologies, that brought indigenous perspectives alongside academic analysis, that recognized the lines as part of living heritage rather than dead monuments. This awakening had multiple sources. UNESCO's 1994 designation of the lines as World Heritage Site brought international attention, established them as treasures belonging to all humanity, created framework for protection and study that transcended national boundaries. But designation alone wouldn't have created Renaissance. That required people willing to see the lines differently, to ask new questions, to challenge assumptions about what the geoglyphs meant and how they should be understood. Indigenous communities throughout the Andes began asserting their connections to ancient sites, reclaiming histories that had been studied primarily by outsiders, insisting that their perspectives and traditional knowledge deserved consideration alongside archaeological evidence. This movement, part of broader indigenous rights activism across the Americas, brought new voices to discussions about the Nazca Lines, challenged interpretations that had ignored or minimized indigenous understanding, demanded that descendant communities have say in how their ancestors' achievements were studied, presented, preserved. Some researchers resisted this participation, argued that archaeological interpretation should be based on evidence rather than contemporary beliefs, worried that involving indigenous communities would compromise scientific objectivity. But others recognized that indigenous knowledge, while not archaeological evidence in traditional sense, provided valuable perspective, suggested interpretations that outsiders might miss, connected ancient practices to living traditions that persisted throughout the Andes despite centuries of colonialism and cultural suppression. The recognition that Nazca Seki system connected to broader Andean traditions of sacred geography emerged partly from this inclusion of indigenous perspectives. Andean peoples still maintained ceremonial pathways, still organized space according to principles that might illuminate how ancient peoples understood landscape. Their input helped researchers see the lines not as isolated mystery, but as part of continuous tradition, as expression of worldview that, while transformed over centuries, retained recognizable elements connecting present to past. New technologies contributed to Renaissance as well. Satellite imagery made it possible to discover geoglyphs that aerial photography had missed, revealed the full extent of the system in ways previous surveys couldn't achieve. Researchers from Japan's Yamagata University used high-resolution satellite data combined with ground surveys to document hundreds of previously unknown figures, demonstrating that even after decades of study, the Pampa still held secrets, still had discoveries waiting for eyes trained to see them. Drone photography provided flexible, affordable way to document the lines from aerial perspectives, allowed detailed mapping without environmental impact of repeated airplane flights, made it possible for more researchers to study features that previously required expensive aerial survey. This democratization of technology meant smaller institutions, individual researchers, even interested amateurs could contribute to documentation and study, could add their perspectives to understanding that had been dominated by well-funded expeditions and established institutions. Computer analysis allowed pattern recognition at scales impossible for human observation alone. Programs could analyze thousands of lines simultaneously, identify statistical correlations, test hypotheses about alignments or distributions with mathematical rigor that manual methods couldn't achieve. These tools confirmed some traditional theories while disproving others, brought precision to debates that had often relied on subjective interpretation, advanced understanding while humbling researchers who discovered that many cherished ideas didn't survive quantitative analysis. The Renaissance included artistic responses to the lines. Musicians composed pieces inspired by the desert, by the mystery and beauty of ancient achievement. Writers created novels and poems that imagined the lives of people who built the geoglyphs, that explored what it meant to create art that outlasts memory. Visual artists made works referencing the lines, using them as inspiration for contemporary pieces that connected ancient and modern aesthetic concerns. Educational initiatives brought the lines into curricula throughout Peru and internationally. Students study the geoglyphs not just as archaeological curiosity, but as example of mathematical precision, artistic vision, cultural expression, environmental adaptation. The lines became teaching tools for subjects ranging from geometry to anthropology to climate science, demonstrated how single archaeological site could illuminate multiple aspects of human experience and knowledge. Maria Reicher, who died in 1998 at age 95, lived long enough to witness the beginning of this renaissance, to see the lines receive recognition and protection she'd fought for decades to secure. Her house near the lines became a museum, her legacy honoured by the Peruvian government and international archaeological community, her decades of solitary dedication finally acknowledged as foundational to everything that followed. The Renaissance wasn't complete transformation, didn't solve all problems or answer all questions about the lines. Threats persisted, understanding remained, partial debates continued about interpretation and meaning. But something had changed fundamentally. The lines were no longer obscure archaeological curiosity known mainly to specialists. They had become celebrated achievement, recognized symbol of ancient sophistication, focal point for conversations about heritage and identity and human capability that extended far beyond archaeology into broader cultural consciousness. The awakening represented recognition that ancient peoples deserve credit for their achievements, that indigenous Americans created sophisticated civilizations worthy of respect and serious study, that human history includes chapters often overlooked or dismissed by narratives focused on European or Mediterranean civilizations. The Nazca Lines became evidence that sophistication, artistry, mathematical knowledge, organizational capability all existed in the Americas long before European contact, that the full story of human achievement requires attending to voices and accomplishments that dominant narratives too often ignored. After more than 8 decades of study, after countless theories proposed and debated, after technologies applied and evidence analysed, after indigenous voices added to archaeological interpretation, a deeper truth about the Nazca Lines emerged, not from single, dramatic discovery, but from gradual accumulation of understanding, from pieces fitting together into picture more complex and more human than any single explanation could capture. The lines were never meant primarily for gods above. They were meant for the people who walked them, who created them, who maintained them, who gathered on them for ceremonies that affirmed community and renewed cosmic obligations. The fact that they could be seen from the sky wasn't their purpose but their consequence, result of scale necessary to accommodate gatherings, to mark territory, to create monuments worthy of the effort required, to express through landscape modification the importance of beliefs and practices that sustained Nazca civilization. This revelation came from multiple directions simultaneously. Careful analysis of how the lines connected to settlements and ceremonial centres showed they functioned as networks, pathways linking communities, defining relationships between groups, organising sacred geography in ways that paralleled documented Andean traditions. The lines weren't messages to mountain gods so much as roads to mountain gods, routes that pilgrims followed, ways of physically moving through landscape that connected human settlements to sacred peaks, that made the journey itself an act of devotion. The trapezoids, those massive geometric clearings that covered more area than any other feature, revealed their purpose through excavation and careful mapping. They were gathering places, ceremonial plazas created on the pampa rather than in settlements, spaces where communities came together for rituals focused on water, on fertility, on maintaining relationships with divine forces that controlled survival. The widening shape that had puzzled researchers made sense once you understood them as accommodating processions, groups that would enter at the narrow end and spread out as they advanced, creating visual drama, allowing everyone to participate, transforming ceremony into experience that engaged bodies moving through space as well as minds contemplating meaning. The animal figures served as markers, identifiers, reference points within complex system of lines and gathering places. They weren't meant to be viewed from above but to be recognized from ground level by people who knew what they represented, who understood the symbolism, who could identify which line or which ceremonial area by the figure associated with it. The fact that modern viewers can only appreciate their full form from the air is accident of preservation and technology, not indication of original intention. Recent research combining archaeological evidence with ethnographic study of living Andean traditions revealed how shamanic practices might have incorporated the lines. Shamans throughout the Andes use psychoactive plants to induce altered states, to journey in spiritual form, to communicate with ancestors and gods. During these journeys, practitioners report experiences of flight, of seeing landscape from above, of perceiving patterns invisible to ordinary consciousness. If Nazca shamans practice similar techniques, if they believed their spiritual vision could encompass entire geoglyphs from aerial perspectives, achieved through altered consciousness rather than physical flight, then creating figures visible from above makes perfect sense, becomes art made for eyes that see beyond normal human limitations. The lines were social technology as much as religious expression, were ways of creating and maintaining civilization in an environment that made cooperation essential for survival. When communities gathered to clear a new line or maintain an existing one, they were practicing cooperation, were demonstrating commitment to shared goals, were teaching children that individual survival depended on group cohesion, were renewing bonds that made it possible to build puquios, to manage irrigation systems, to distribute water fairly, to survive droughts through mutual support rather than destructive competition. The revelation explained why the lines continued to be created for centuries, why generation after generation invested labour in expanding the system even after hundreds of lines already existed. Each new line wasn't redundant, but was that generation's contribution, was proof of their devotion, was their way of participating in tradition that connected them to ancestors and to descendants, that made them part of story larger than their individual lives. It explained why the lines were so carefully maintained, even as Nazca culture struggled through climate crisis and eventual collapse. Maintaining the lines meant maintaining connection to ancestors who had created them, meant refusing to abandon beliefs and practices that defined identity, meant asserting that culture mattered even when material circumstances made survival difficult. The fact that some lines continued to be maintained even as settlements were abandoned, even as population declined and society fragmented, testified to how deeply the tradition was embedded in Nazca consciousness, how much it meant beyond practical utility. This didn't mean research was futile or that interpretation was impossible. It meant that humility was required, that certainty was inappropriate, that the best we could do was approach the lines with respect, gather evidence carefully, propose interpretations tentatively, remain open to revising understanding as new evidence emerged, or new perspectives revealed limitations in previous thinking. The final revelation was that the Nazca lines didn't need to be fully understood to be valued, didn't need to surrender all their mysteries to deserve preservation and appreciation. They could remain partially mysterious, could retain questions that had no certain answers, could speak to us across centuries in language we only partly comprehended. The inability to know everything didn't diminish their importance, but perhaps enhanced it, reminded us that history contains depths we can't fully plumb, that ancient peoples had inner lives as complex as our own, that monuments outlast the complete understanding that created them and continue to speak in voices that later generations hear imperfectly, but can still recognize as profound, as meaningful, as worthy of attention and wonder. Late afternoon in the Nazca Desert, when shadows lengthen and temperature begins its nightly plunge, is the best time to think about what these ancient lines mean for us today. For peoples separated from their creators by more than 14 centuries, by technological revolutions that would seem like magic to ancient eyes, by changes in how we understand the world that make even recent history feel remote, stand on the pampa in that golden light, and the questions become personal, immediate, impossible to dismiss as merely academic. Modern society, with rare exceptions, doesn't build this way anymore. We build for decades, perhaps a century if we're ambitious, but rarely for millennia. We design with planned obsolescence, create for quick consumption and rapid replacement, prioritize immediate utility over long-term endurance. The Nazca lines challenge this orientation, remind us that humans once thought in longer timeframes, once created with intention that their work should last, should speak to peoples they would never meet, should carry meaning forward through time even if the specific beliefs that motivated creation wouldn't survive. The lines also reveal how completely civilizations can fail, how utterly a culture's achievements can be forgotten by its own descendants. The people living in the Nazca region when Spanish conquistadors arrived had only vague legends about the lines, couldn't explain who made them or why, had lost the knowledge that their own ancestors had possessed. This should humble us, should remind us that nothing we create is guaranteed to persist in understanding, even if it persists in physical form, that knowledge we consider fundamental could be lost within generations if not actively preserved and transmitted. Climate change emerges as a central lesson from Nazca history. A sophisticated civilization, one that had endured for centuries, that had developed remarkable technologies for water management, that had created art and architecture and social systems that worked, collapsed when environmental conditions shifted beyond their capacity to adapt. The drought that destroyed Nazca civilization wasn't caused by human activity, wasn't something they could have prevented, but it destroyed them just the same, proved that even intelligent, capable, dedicated peoples can fail when nature changes the rules. We face similar challenges now, except the climate changes we experience are partly our own creation, are consequences of choices we've made collectively, are therefore potentially preventable if we act with sufficient urgency and cooperation. The Nazca people didn't have that option, couldn't stop the drought that ended their civilization. We do have options, can choose to reduce emissions, to adapt infrastructure, to prepare for changes already inevitable, while working to prevent even more severe disruptions. Whether we will make those choices, whether we possess the collective will to act on timescales that extend beyond election cycles and quarterly earnings reports, remains to be seen. The lines teach about the relationship between culture and environment, about how peoples create meaning in landscapes that challenge survival. The Nazca region is harsh, inhospitable, barely able to support human life even with sophisticated water management. Yet people not only survived there but created beauty, made art, developed rich cultural traditions. This demonstrates that human flourishing isn't just about material abundance, isn't limited to places with easy conditions, can emerge anywhere that people commit to creating meaning, to building community, to expressing through art and ritual and shared effort, something that transcends mere survival. It also demonstrates that environmental limitations matter, that culture exists in dialogue with ecology, that when environment changes beyond certain thresholds, cultural adaptations that once worked become inadequate. The Nazca people's response to drought, creating more lines, intensifying ceremonies, increasing offerings to gods, made sense within their belief system but couldn't address the fundamental problem that water had stopped coming. Sometimes faith isn't enough. Sometimes dedication can't overcome material constraints. Sometimes civilizations fail, despite doing everything their traditions told them was right. The preservation challenges the lines face today mirror broader heritage questions. How do we balance protection with access? How do we prevent damage while allowing people to experience sites that matter? How do we respect Indigenous perspectives while maintaining scientific standards? How do we fund preservation when immediate needs like poverty and healthcare demand resources? These aren't just Nazca questions, but global challenges facing archaeological sites, historical monuments, cultural landscapes everywhere. The lines remind us that heritage belongs to future generations as much as present ones, that we're custodians, not owners, that our obligation is to pass forward what we've inherited, preferably in better condition than we received it. This requires long-term thinking, requires investing resources in preservation, even when immediate benefits aren't obvious, requires resisting temptations to exploit heritage for short-term gain, whether economic or political or ideological. We can honour them by learning from both their successes and their failures, by recognising our own vulnerabilities, by creating with intention that our works should endure not just physically, but in understanding, by preserving what they left behind so that future generations can also encounter these lines, can also wonder what it meant to create them, can also reflect on what human achievement looks like when viewed across the vast distances of time. The lines endure. After 2,000 years of sun and wind, after the civilization that created them collapsed and was forgotten, after centuries when no one remembered their purpose or honoured their makers, after rediscovery and study and tourism and all the attention and threat that modern world has brought, the lines still stretch across the Nazca Pampa, still visible from the sky, still speaking in their silent language about human faith and effort and the desire to create meaning that outlast individual lives. Today, if you fly over the desert in one of the small planes that carry tourists, You see what Maria Reich spent decades protecting, what researchers have spent careers studying, what UNESCO has designated as heritage belonging to all humanity. The hummingbird spreads its wings across hundreds of feet of rust-coloured earth. The spider waits in geometric perfection. The monkey curves its tail in an endless spiral. The straight lines extend toward mountains that still seem to touch the sky, still seem like places where gods might dwell, where water originates, where prayers might be heard. But you also see things the ancient creators never anticipated. You see the Pan-American Highway cutting through the northern edge of the protected zone, a modern line that serves modern purposes, connecting cities and commerce with the same certainty that ancient lines once connected ceremonial centres and communities. You see the small airstrip built specifically for tourist flights, see the observation tower that allows visitors to appreciate some figures from elevated perspective without needing to charter flights. You see the museum that houses Maria Reich's work, her maps and photographs and measuring instruments, her legacy preserved as carefully as the lines she devoted her life to protecting. You see evidence of ongoing research, areas where archaeologists have established grids for systematic survey, places where new technologies are being tested, locations where preservation work continues. The lines aren't static historical monument but living archaeological site, still yielding discoveries, still generating questions, still requiring active protection against threats both human and environmental. And you see the broader landscape, the valleys where modern towns sit near ancient settlements, where farmers still use pukios built 2 millennia ago, where irrigation channels still bring water from underground aquifers to fields that still produce crops despite the desert that surrounds them. The Nazca people's engineering legacy persists not just in lines on the desert, but in functional infrastructure that serves descendants of the people who created it, that connects past to present in ways more practical than symbolic. The legacy includes the traditions of landscape art the lines inspired, the recognition that monumental art doesn't require building upward but can modify terrain itself, can work at environmental scale, can create meaning through subtle changes to existing surfaces rather than dramatic construction of new structures. Modern land artists acknowledge this debt, recognize the Nazca Lines as precedent for practices that seemed revolutionary in the 20th century, but had actually been performed 2,000 years earlier. It includes the preservation methodologies developed to protect the lines, the techniques for managing heritage sites in harsh environments, the frameworks for balancing access and protection, the models for international cooperation in archaeological preservation. The challenges Nazca presented forced innovation in conservation, generated approaches that have been applied to sites worldwide, contributed to broader understanding of how to protect fragile heritage for future generations. It includes the ongoing research that continues to reveal new information, to refine understanding, to discover features that decades of previous study had missed. The Japanese team's recent discoveries of hundreds of previously unknown geoglyphs proved that even intensively studied sites can still surprise us, that patience and new technologies can reveal what earlier eyes overlooked, that the process of understanding heritage is never complete but continually evolves. The legacy also includes the mistakes made, the lessons learned through error. The early tourism that damaged some lines taught us about the need for controlled access, for regulations that protect while allowing experience. The pseudo-scientific theories that gained popular traction despite lacking evidence taught us about the importance of public education, about the need to communicate archaeological findings effectively, about what happens when scientists cede public discourse to those willing to make dramatic claims without evidence. Maria Reich's personal legacy deserves special recognition. She demonstrated what individual dedication can accomplish, how one person's commitment can change how world values heritage, how someone without official position or institutional backing can still make enormous difference through persistence and passion and willingness to devote a life to cause larger than personal comfort or advancement. Her house museum near the lines receives visitors who come to honour her memory as much as to see the geoglyphs, who recognise that the line's preservation required human champion, required someone willing to fight for them when easier paths would have been walking away. But the ultimate legacy remains the lines themselves, still there in the desert, still visible, still mysterious, still beautiful. They've survived everything that 2 millennia could throw at them except complete understanding. They persist as testimony that humans once lived in the Nazca Valley, once created civilization in the desert, once made art that spoke to forces beyond human ken, once believed that their work mattered enough to invest enormous effort in creating something permanent. And perhaps that's the most important legacy of all. Not the specific purposes the lines served, not the astronomical alignments or water symbolism or pilgrimage routes or whatever combination of functions they fulfilled, but simply that they exist, that they persist, that they prove humans can create works that outlast everything, that speak across centuries to peoples who don't share the creator's language or beliefs or circumstances, that carry meaning forward through time even when specific meanings are lost. The Nazca Lines remind us that we're part of something larger than our individual lives, part of human story that extends backward to ancestors we never knew and forward to descendants we'll never meet. They challenge us to think about what we're creating that might similarly endure, what marks we're leaving, what legacy we're building. They offer hope that human achievement can survive catastrophic change, can speak to futures we can't imagine, can matter in ways we can't predict. And they invite us, as they've invited generations of observers, to wonder, to question, to imagine what it was like to be human in a different time and place, to feel connected across vast distances of history to people whose names we don't know, but whose works we can still see, still appreciate, still recognize as expressions of something fundamental about what it means to be human, to create, to believe, to leave marks that say we were here, we mattered, we made beauty in the desert, we dreamed that our works would endure. The sun sets over the pampa, the lines fade into shadow, stars emerge in the darkening sky, the same stars that ancient peoples watched from this same desert, finding in their patterns meaning and order and connection to forces beyond earthly concern. The desert grows cold, the silence deepens, and the lines remain, waiting patiently for tomorrow's sun, for next week's tourists, for future researchers with questions we haven't thought to ask yet, for all the generations still to come who will stand where we stand now, will look at what ancient hands created, will wonder what it meant and what it means, will add their interpretations to the long conversation about these mysterious marks in the Peruvian desert that speak to us still across the vast silence of time.